The Boeing 787 Dreamliner cut through 37,000 feet of crystalline air above the Pacific, its twin Rolls-Royce Trent engines humming their familiar lullaby to the 312 souls aboard. In Seat 9C, Dr. Evelyn Ghost, Nakamura closed her leather-bound copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War and glanced at her Patek Philippe watch. 14 hours into the Tokyo to Los Angeles flight, most passengers had surrendered to sleep or screens. She preferred the silence, the way it wrapped around her thoughts like the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor at altitude. The turbulence hit without warning, not the gentle bump of everyday air pockets, but a violent, sustained shaking that sent laptops flying and oxygen masks dancing from their overhead compartments. Emergency lighting bathed the cabin in amber as the aircraft pitched forward into a steep dive. Through the porthole window, Evelyn watched the Pacific Ocean rushing up to meet them, its surface transformed from peaceful blue to threatening darkness. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice crackled through the intercom system, professional but strained. "We are experiencing a technical emergency. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." Technical emergency. Evelyn's trained ear caught the careful euphemism, the way military briefers said casualty instead of death. She unfastened her seatbelt and moved toward the cockpit, ignoring the flight attendant's protests. Her billionaire status had purchased this first-class ticket, but it was her other credentials, the ones hidden beneath expensive civilian clothes and a deliberately unremarkable demeanor, that mattered now. The cockpit door stood open, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. Captain Morrison, a silver-haired veteran of commercial aviation, worked frantically at his controls while his first officer, barely 30 and pale with shock, struggled with emergency checklists. Through the windscreen, altimeter readings spun downward, 28,000 feet, 26,000 falling fast. "Hydraulics are gone," Morrison announced to his crew, sweat beading his forehead despite the cabin's cool temperature. "Primary flight controls non-responsive. We're running on backup systems only." Evelyn stepped into the doorway. Her 5'4" frame and understated appearance had fooled many people over the years, boardroom adversaries, Pentagon officials, even her own squadron mates during her military service. They saw a quiet Asian American woman in expensive clothes and made assumptions. They never saw the combat veteran who had logged over 3,000 flight hours in military aircraft, who had earned her wings in a world where failure meant death. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions, "I can fly this plane." Morrison turned, taking in her civilian appearance with barely concealed skepticism. Behind him, warning lights painted the instrument panel in urgent reds and yellows, while the altimeter continued its relentless countdown toward catastrophe. The interrogation began immediately, as Evelyn had known it would. Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, searching for any sign of delusion or panic-induced heroism. Flight attendants crowded behind her in the narrow galley, their training warring with disbelief. A passenger, a middle-aged businesswoman claiming she could save them all, was either their salvation or their final cruel joke. "Ma'am, I appreciate your willingness to help," Morrison said, his tone diplomatically dismissive. "But this is a Boeing 787, not a video game, unless you're a commercial pilot." Colonel Evelyn Nakamura, call sign Ghost, United States Air Force, retired. She delivered her credentials with military precision, each word cutting through the chaos like a blade. F-22 Raptor pilot, 3,200 flight hours, including emergency procedures and combat operations. I've flown everything from trainers to tactical fighters to experimental aircraft. The first officer looked up from his emergency checklist, confusion replacing panic momentarily. "F-22, but you're..." "A woman, yes." Evelyn stepped fully into the cockpit, her movements economical and purposeful. "Also someone who's landed damaged aircraft on shorter runways than this plane needs, with less engine power than we currently have available. Morrison's skepticism remained etched across his weathered features. Commercial aviation was his world: procedures, checklists, gradual decision-making processes designed for safety and predictability. Military aviation operated under different rules, where split-second choices separated survival from catastrophe. The gap between their two worlds might as well have been a chasm. "Look, Lady Colonel, whatever," he said, hands never leaving the controls as the aircraft continued its controlled but terrifying descent. "I've been flying commercial jets for 28 years. This bird has systems and characteristics you've never." An alarm pierced the air. Engine 2's oil pressure warning light flashed red, followed immediately by automated announcements from the aircraft's computer systems. Evelyn watched the captain's face transform as their marginal situation became critical. With hydraulics compromised and now engine complications, they were rapidly approaching the edge of survivability. 18,000 feet, the first officer announced, his voice tight with professional control barely containing raw fear. Evelyn moved to the observer's seat behind the pilots, her eyes scanning the instrument displays with the systematic efficiency of someone trained to absorb and process complex information under extreme stress. The 787's glass cockpit shared fundamental principles with military aircraft: altitude, airspeed, heading, engine parameters. The presentation differed, but the physics remained constant. "Captain, with respect, you have approximately 4 minutes before you'll be forced into emergency approach procedures with compromised controls and potentially compromised power." Her voice remained steady, almost conversational. "I'm not asking you to step aside. I'm offering to assist." Through the windscreen, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions. Morrison's internal struggle played out across his face in real time. Protocol demanded he maintain command of his aircraft. Pride insisted he could handle any emergency his experience might encounter. But mathematics, cold, unforgiving numbers spinning across his instrument panel, suggested otherwise. Altitude, 14,000 feet. Descent rate, still excessive despite his best efforts. Engine parameters deteriorating. "What's your civilian flight status?" he asked finally, a grudging acknowledgement that desperation might override regulation. "Current commercial multi-engine rating, instrument certified, but that's not what matters right now." Evelyn leaned forward, pointing to the engine display. "Oil temperature on engine 2 is climbing past redline. You're going to lose power completely within minutes, not hours. This becomes a gliding problem, and gliding problems require different solutions than powered approaches." The first officer, his nameplate read Stevens, looked between them with the expression of someone watching his professional world collapse into chaos. "Ma'am, no offense, but military aircraft don't weigh 400,000 pounds fully loaded. They don't have 300 passengers depending on." "They do have pilots depending on making the right choice when everything goes wrong," Evelyn interrupted, "which is what's happening right now." As if summoned by her words, Engine 2's oil pressure alarm joined the cacophony of warnings filling the cockpit. Morrison's face went ashen as he processed the implications. Single-engine operations in a Boeing 787 were possible but complex, requiring immediate action and flawless execution. With hydraulic problems complicating control response, the difficulty multiplied exponentially. 10,000 feet, Stevens announced. The captain's hands moved across his controls with practiced efficiency, following emergency procedures drilled into his muscle memory through decades of training and simulation. But Evelyn could see the subtle tremor in his movements, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Stress responses she'd witnessed in combat situations, in herself and others, when the difference between life and death compressed into microseconds of decision-making. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the technical chaos with quiet authority, "let me help you bring them home." Outside the windscreen, the California coastline materialized through morning haze. a thin line separating endless ocean from solid ground, hope from catastrophe. Los Angeles International Airport lay somewhere ahead, runways and emergency crews preparing for their arrival. But between their current position and safety stretched minutes that would determine whether 312 people would see another sunset. Morrison finally nodded, a barely perceptible gesture that transferred partial control of their collective fate to the unassuming woman behind him. The transformation from passenger to pilot occurred in heartbeats. Evelyn slipped into the jump seat with fluid precision, her fingers dancing across unfamiliar but logically arranged controls while her eyes tracked critical flight parameters. The 787 systems responded differently than the F-22s she'd known intimately, but aircraft were aircraft, machines of metal and composites that obeyed the same fundamental laws of physics whether they carried weapons or passengers. Engine 2 shutdown complete, Morrison announced, his voice regaining some of its professional composure now that he had assistance. Single-engine approach checklist initiated. Agreed, but let's modify standard procedures. Evelyn's hands moved to the flight management system, inputting calculations with the speed of someone accustomed to making complex mathematical decisions while pulling multiple GS in combat maneuvers. With compromised hydraulics, we need a different approach profile. Lower, slower, with more time to configure. Stevens looked up from his emergency checklist, skepticism still evident despite their desperate circumstances. Ma'am, standard procedures exist for reasons. They're tested, certified. Standard procedures assume standard failures, Evelyn replied, her fingers never pausing in their calculations. We have cascading system failures that require adapted solutions. Captain, what's your current fuel state? Enough for one approach, maybe two if we're lucky. Then we don't get to be unlucky. She turned to face Morrison directly, her expression serious but calm. I'm going to recommend an approach profile that violates several commercial aviation guidelines but maximizes our probability of success given current conditions. It's your aircraft and your decision. The captain studied her face for a long moment, searching for confidence, competence, or the dangerous overconfidence that could kill them all. What he saw was something different, the quiet certainty of someone who had faced death before and emerged intact, not unscathed but whole. What do you have in mind? Evelyn began outlining her approach strategy, her words precise and technical, describing a landing sequence that borrowed from military tactics adapted to civilian aircraft limitations. As she spoke, both Morrison and Stevens found themselves listening not to a passenger with delusions of heroism, but to a pilot whose experience encompassed scenarios they'd never imagined. The radio crackled to life with Los Angeles approach control's voice, professional calm masking the controlled urgency of an emergency in progress. United 447, Los Angeles approach. We have your emergency squawk. Please state nature of emergency and souls on board. Morrison keyed his microphone, his voice steady despite the sweat beading his forehead. Los Angeles approach. United 447 Heavy, declaring emergency. Multiple system failures including hydraulics and engine 2 shutdown. 312 souls on board, requesting immediate vectors for emergency approach to LAX. United 447, emergency declared, squawk 7700. Turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 6000. Emergency equipment standing by. Confirm you are declaring full emergency status. Affirmative, full emergency. United 447 requesting extended final approach due to control difficulties. Evelyn watched the exchange with professional appreciation. Air traffic control protocols existed for exactly these situations: clear communication, immediate priority handling, elimination of non-essential traffic conflicts. The system worked when everyone executed their roles flawlessly. Captain, she said quietly, recommend requesting runway 25 left. Longest available, best approach profile for our current configuration. Morrison nodded and relayed the request. Through the windscreen, Lowe's angels sprawled beneath them, millions of people going about their morning routines unaware that 312 lives hung in the balance above their heads. The city looked deceptively peaceful from 6,000 feet, its freeways threading between neighborhoods like arterial pathways in some vast organism. Stevens called out their altitude and airspeed with mechanical precision, his earlier panic replaced by focused professionalism. Whatever his initial doubts about Evelyn's qualifications, the reality of their situation demanded cooperation over skepticism. 5,000 feet, 160 knots on profile. Gear down, Evelyn recommended. We need the additional drag for energy management. The landing gear extended with mechanical precision, accompanied by the subtle change in airframe acoustics that every pilot recognized. 3 green lights confirmed proper extension, small victories in a series of systems that needed to function perfectly for their survival. United 447, contact Lowe's Angels Tower on 120.95. Good luck. The frequency change brought them closer to their destination. Each radio call a step in the carefully choreographed dance between aircraft and ground control that would determine their fate. Los Angeles International Airport materialized through the morning haze like a concrete oasis, its parallel runways stretching toward the horizon in precise geometric lines. From their altitude, emergency vehicles appeared as tiny red and yellow dots positioned at strategic intervals, crews of firefighters and paramedics preparing for outcomes that ranged from routine to catastrophic. United 447 Heavy, Lowe's Angels Tower. Runway 25 left cleared for emergency landing. Wind 240 at 8 knots. Emergency equipment in position. Morrison acknowledged the clearance while Evelyn continued her systematic evaluation of their approach profile. 4,000 feet altitude, properly configured, airspeed stabilizing within acceptable parameters. The mathematics of their situation had improved from impossible to merely improbable, progress she'd take gladly. Flaps 20, she called. The wing surfaces reconfigured themselves, generating additional lift at the cost of increased drag. Every configuration change represented a calculated risk in their current state, but without normal control authority, they needed every aerodynamic advantage available. 3,000 feet approach speed. Through the windscreen, runway 25 left grew from a distant line to a tangible destination. Evelyn could see the numbers painted on its threshold, markers that would either welcome them safely to Earth or become the coordinates of their collective failure. Captain, small correction to the right. We're drifting slightly left of center line. Morrison's hands moved the controls with gentle precision, fighting the aircraft's tendency to overrespond to inputs without normal hydraulic assistance. The nose moved right incrementally, bringing them back toward the runway's extended center line. 2,000 feet on profile. Behind them in the passenger cabin, 310 people trusted their lives to the skills and decisions being made in the cockpit. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing passengers for emergency landing procedures with calm efficiency that masked their own fears. Some passengers prayed, others stared out windows at the approaching runway. A few slept, unaware that their nap might become eternal. Flaps 30, landing checklist complete. The final configuration change transformed the Boeing 787 from a sleek transport into a flying truck, stable, predictable, but requiring constant attention to maintain proper flight path control. Evelyn felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft balanced on the edge of controllability, where small corrections prevented large disasters. 1,000 feet, runway in sight. The threshold of runway 25 left rushed toward them, concrete and painted markings growing larger with each second. Morrison's experience showed in his smooth control inputs, keeping them aligned with the runway centerline despite the compromised flight controls. Beside him, Stevens called out altitudes and airspeeds with mechanical precision. The moment of truth approached with mathematical inevitability. In less than 60 seconds, they would either complete a successful emergency landing or become a tragedy measured in statistics and investigated in committee rooms. The difference lay in the accumulated skills, experience, and judgment of three people working together in a cockpit above Los Angeles. 500 feet on speed. Evelyn's hands remained poised over the controls, ready to assist if Morrison needed help during the critical final moments. Through the windscreen, she could see individual emergency vehicles, their crews watching their approach with professional intensity. The concrete runway filled their vision, painted markings and embedded lights creating a precise pathway toward safety. The main landing gear touched runway concrete with a firm thump that reverberated through the aircraft's structure, followed immediately by the nose gear making contact. Morrison applied reverse thrust on their single-functioning engine while engaging wheel brakes, the combined deceleration forces pressing everyone forward against their restraints. "On the ground, Lax," Morrison announced to the tower, his voice carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measure. Emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately, fire trucks and ambulances positioned at strategic intervals along their taxi path. Through the cockpit windows, Evelyn could see firefighters in full protective gear, their faces serious as they evaluated the aircraft for signs of fire or structural damage. United 447, taxi clear of the active runway when able. Emergency vehicles will escort you to the gate. The taxi to their assigned gate proceeded at walking speed, emergency vehicles flanking them like an honor guard. Inside the passenger cabin, spontaneous applause erupted as people realized they had survived what could have been a catastrophic accident. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking for injuries and providing reassurance to shaken passengers. Stevens completed his post-landing checklist with methodical precision, each item verified and confirmed. The routine tasks of shutting down systems and securing the aircraft provided a sense of normalcy after the preceding emergency. Engine shutdown complete, parking checklist finished. Morrison finally removed his hands from the controls and turned to face Evelyn. The skepticism that had marked his initial reaction to her assistance had been replaced by something approaching respect, the acknowledgement that her unconventional expertise had contributed to their survival. "Colonel," he said quietly, "thank you." Evelyn unbuckled her harness and stood, her movements showing none of the adrenaline aftermath that often followed high-stress situations. Years of military training had taught her to maintain emotional equilibrium during crises, to process fear and uncertainty without allowing them to compromise performance. "Captain Morrison, you flew a textbook emergency approach under impossible conditions. Stevens, your checklist discipline kept us organized when chaos threatened. It was a team effort." Outside the aircraft, news crews were already assembling, their cameras and reporters preparing to document the story of Flight 447's emergency landing. Within hours, the incident would become national news, another aviation emergency that ended in survival rather than tragedy. As passengers began deplaning through the jet bridge, many stopped to thank the flight crew. Some recognized Evelyn as the woman who had entered the cockpit during the crisis, though few understood the full extent of her contribution to their survival. The terminal's familiar sounds, announcements, conversations, the distant hum of air conditioning, seemed almost surreal after the intense focus of the emergency. Normal life resumed with startling speed, as if the previous hour of potential catastrophe had been merely an interruption in the day's routine. Federal Aviation Administration investigators would spend weeks analyzing flight data recorders, and interviewing crew members, documenting every decision and action that had contributed to the successful outcome. Their report would ultimately commend the crew's professional handling of multiple system failures under extreme pressure. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of crisis averted, Evelyn Nakamura collected her carry-on bag and prepared to disappear back into civilian life. Her business suit and understated demeanor would once again camouflage the combat veteran who had helped save 312 lives above the Pacific Ocean. The immigration and customs procedures at LAX proceeded with typical bureaucratic efficiency, officials processing passengers from Flight 447 with no indication that they had recently participated in a minor aviation miracle. Evelyn's diplomatic passport expedited her clearance, and within an hour of landing, she found herself in the back seat of a hired car heading toward Beverly Hills. Her driver, a talkative Armenian immigrant named Aram, had the radio tuned to a news station that was already reporting the emergency landing. Crazy thing, you know. Plane almost crashes, but everybody's okay. Makes you think about luck and skill, which is more important. Both, Evelyn replied, watching Los Angeles traffic through tinted windows. Usually both. Her phone buzzed with messages. Business associates, family members, and Pentagon contacts who had seen the news reports and connected her name to the passenger manifest. Word traveled quickly in military aviation circles, especially when a retired fighter pilot became involved in civilian emergencies. The Beverly Hills Hotel appeared ahead, its pink facade and palm trees representing a return to the comfortable predictability of her post-military life. Wealth and success had provided her with options and opportunities that most veterans never experienced, but they could never entirely erase the identity forged in cockpits and combat zones. Her suite on the third floor offered a panoramic view of the Los Angeles Basin, the same terrain she had seen from 6,000 feet during their emergency approach. The perspective was different now, peaceful, ordered, domesticated, but she could still trace the path they had flown from ocean to runway. A bottle of champagne waited on ice, courtesy of the hotel management, along with a handwritten note congratulating her on her safe arrival. Such gestures were common in establishments that catered to wealthy clientele, personal touches that justified premium pricing. Evelyn opened her laptop and began reviewing the technical presentations she would deliver tomorrow to defense contractors interested in her aerospace consulting firm. The work was intellectually challenging and financially rewarding, applying her military expertise to civilian aviation problems. But tonight, her mind returned repeatedly to the cockpit of Flight 447, to the weight of responsibility for 312 lives, to the familiar clarity that came when training and experience converged in moments of absolute necessity. Outside her hotel window, Los Angeles continued its perpetual motion, millions of people unaware that their city had witnessed another small victory of human skill over mechanical failure. The congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. was filled to capacity 3 months later. Committee members and spectators gathered to examine the circumstances surrounding Flight 447's emergency landing. Evelyn sat at the witness table, her appearance carefully chosen to project professional competence. Conservative business suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that suggested seriousness without severity. Committee Chairman Senator Patricia Hawkins opened the session with a summary of the incident, reading from prepared notes that reduced their harrowing experience to clinical facts and figures. On March 15th, United Airlines Flight 447 experienced multiple system failures requiring an emergency landing at Los Angeles International Airport. All passengers and crew survived without injury. The questioning began with technical details, system failure analysis, crew response protocols, regulatory compliance issues that concerned bureaucrats more than the human drama of survival. Evelyn answered each inquiry with precision, her military bearing evident in her posture and speech patterns. Colonel Nakamura, Senator Hawkins continued, some observers have questioned whether civilian aviation regulation should permit non-crew members to assist in emergency situations. What is your response to those concerns? Evelyn considered her answer carefully, aware that her words would influence policy decisions affecting thousands of future passengers. Senator, regulations exist to ensure safety through standardized procedures and qualified personnel. However, emergencies by definition involve circumstances that exceed normal operational parameters. When faced with imminent catastrophe, the priority must be preserving human life through any available means. A committee member from Montana leaned forward, his expression skeptical. But you're asking us to believe that military flight training translates directly to commercial aviation. Aren't these fundamentally different types of flying? They are different applications of the same fundamental principles, Evelyn replied. Aircraft respond to control inputs according to laws of physics that don't change based on their intended mission. A pilot trained to land a damaged fighter on an aircraft carrier possesses skills relevant to landing a damaged airliner on a concrete runway. The hearing continued for 3 hours, exploring regulatory implications, training requirements, and liability considerations that would occupy lawyers and legislators for months. But beneath the bureaucratic language lay a simpler truth, that preparation, competence, and calm decision-making could overcome circumstances that seemed hopeless. As the session concluded, several committee members approached Evelyn personally, expressing gratitude for her service and curiosity about her post-military career. The conversation was polite, professional, and utterly predictable, the kind of interaction that occurred regularly in Washington's corridors of power. Walking through the Capitol building afterward, Evelyn reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her from Air Force Academy cadet to combat pilot, to billionaire entrepreneur, to emergency landing participant. Each phase of her life had prepared her for the next, building a reservoir of experience and confidence that proved valuable in unexpected circumstances. Her phone rang as she exited the building into Washington's humid spring air. The caller ID showed Morrison's number. They had maintained contact since the incident, bound together by shared experience and mutual respect that transcended their different backgrounds. Evelyn, it's Jim Morrison. I wanted you to know that the FAA final report came out today. They're recommending changes to emergency procedures based on our experience. What kind of changes? Recognition that qualified pilots, regardless of their specific aircraft experience, may provide valuable assistance during emergencies. It's a small step, but it acknowledges that desperate situations require flexible solutions. As Evelyn walked toward her waiting car, she thought about the ripple effects of a single incident, how 30 minutes above the Pacific Ocean had influenced policy, inspired regulatory changes, and demonstrated the value of experience across different domains of expertise. The driver held her door open with practiced deference, another small gesture in a life filled with privileges and opportunities. But as they pulled away from the Capitol building, her mind returned once again to the weight of controls in her hands, the steady voice of air traffic control, and the moment when preparation met necessity 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. In the months that followed, Evelyn's aerospace consulting firm experienced unprecedented growth. Defense contractors and civilian aviation companies sought her expertise, drawn by the combination of combat experience and demonstrated crisis management skills. Her client list expanded to include major airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies dealing with complex technical challenges. The speaking engagements came next: aviation conferences, leadership seminars, corporate events where her story of Flight 447 became a case study in decision-making under pressure. She accepted selected invitations, using the platform to advocate for better training programs and more flexible emergency protocols. But success brought unexpected complications. Media attention increased, with reporters seeking interviews about her military service, business achievements, and role in the emergency landing. She granted few interviews, preferring to maintain the privacy that had always been central to her personality. One evening in her Palo Alto office, working late on a proposal for next-generation flight control systems, Evelyn received a call from Stevens, the first officer from Flight 447. His voice carried excitement mixed with nervousness. "Ma'am, Colonel, I wanted to let you know that I've been accepted into the Air Force Reserve program. I start pilot training next month." Evelyn smiled, remembering her own journey from civilian to military aviator decades earlier. "Congratulations, Stevens. What motivated the decision?" "That day over Lowe's Angels, watching you and Captain Morrison work together, I realized there was more to flying than I'd experienced in commercial aviation. I want to learn those skills, to be prepared for situations where standard procedures aren't enough." After ending the call, Evelyn stood at her office window overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Lights from aircraft moved steadily across the sky, commercial flights carrying passengers between destinations, their occupants trusting their lives to pilots they would never meet. Each aircraft represented the same fundamental challenge she had faced above the Pacific: the marriage of human judgment with mechanical systems, the constant calculation of risk and safety that defined aviation at every level. Some flights would complete their journeys without incident. Others might face emergencies that would test their crew's training, experience, and ability to adapt. Her desk held several framed photographs from her military service, squadron portraits, aircraft she had flown, ceremonies where she had received various commendations. But the image that drew her attention most often was a simple snapshot taken by a passenger on Flight 447, showing her in the cockpit beside Morrison and Stevens during their approach to LAX. In the photograph, her expression showed the focused concentration that had characterized her military career: intense, competent, alert to danger but unafraid of it. The woman in the picture looked exactly like what she was: a pilot doing what pilots do when everything depends on getting it right. The intercom buzzed with her assistant's voice. "Ms. Nakamura, your car is ready for the airport." Another flight awaited, this one routine, first class to Tokyo for meetings with Japanese aerospace manufacturers interested in her consulting services. Commercial aviation had returned to its normal role in her life, a convenient method of transportation rather than the scene of life-and-death drama. As her car navigated evening traffic towards San Francisco International Airport, Evelyn reflected on the strange circularity of her story. She had begun as a passenger on Flight 447, became briefly a pilot, then returned to passenger status. But the experience had reminded her of fundamental truths about identity and competence that success and wealth couldn't erase. At the airport, she moved through security and boarding procedures with the efficiency of someone accustomed to frequent travel. Her first-class seat provided the same comfort and privacy she had enjoyed on Flight 447, before crisis transformed routine into emergency. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, she noticed the other passengers: business travelers, tourists, families beginning journeys that would take them across the Pacific Ocean. They chatted, read, worked on laptops, or gazed out windows with the casual confidence of people for whom flight was simply transportation. The Boeing 777 lifted off from San Francisco International Airport with mechanical precision, its twin engines carrying them into the night sky above the California coast. Through her window, Evelyn watched the city lights fade behind them, replaced by the vast darkness of the Pacific Ocean. Somewhere in that darkness, 3 months earlier, she had helped guide another aircraft safely to Earth. The experience had reminded her that beneath the comfortable surface of civilian life, the skills and instincts forged in military service remained intact, waiting for moments when they would be needed again. The flight attendant offered champagne, which Evelyn accepted with a polite smile. The wine was excellent, the service impeccable, the cabin atmosphere relaxed and pleasant. Everything proceeded exactly as designed, another routine triumph of technology and training over the fundamental hostility of the environment outside the pressurized cabin. As the aircraft settled into its cruise altitude for the Trans-Pacific crossing, Evelyn opened her laptop and began reviewing technical specifications for the guidance systems she would discuss in Tokyo. The work was challenging and important, applying lessons learned from military aviation to civilian applications that could improve safety and efficiency. But part of her attention remained focused on the subtle sounds and sensations of flight, the engine harmonics, the barely perceptible vibrations that indicated proper system operation, the gentle movements that confirmed the aircraft was responding normally to its pilot's commands. She was a passenger again, but she would always be a pilot first. The sky belonged to those with the skills and courage to claim it, whether they wore military uniforms or civilian clothes, whether they commanded fighter jets or commercial airliners, whether they flew by choice or necessity. Outside her window, stars glittered in the thin air above the Pacific Ocean, the same stars that had witnessed countless flights across the decades since humans first achieved powered flight. Each journey represented both routine transportation and minor miracle, the temporary victory of human ingenuity over natural forces that would reclaim any aircraft whose crew failed to maintain constant vigilance. Evelyn Nakamura settled back into her seat and watched the stars, content in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, between earth and sky, trusted with the precious cargo of human life, prepared for whatever challenges the night might bring. The Boeing 777 continued its eastbound journey through the darkness, carrying its passengers safely across the vast Pacific toward Tokyo and whatever destinations lay beyond. In Seat 2A, a woman who had once been called Ghost sat quietly reading, her presence unremarkable to fellow travelers who had no way of knowing that they flew under the protection of someone prepared to guide them safely home if circumstance should once again transform routine into emergency. Above the Pacific Ocean, 37,000 feet above the waves, the aircraft continued its steady progress through the night sky, engines humming their eternal lullaby to the souls aboard who trusted their lives to the marriage of human skill and mechanical precision that made all flight possible. The morning sun rising over the Japanese coastline found Flight 447's passengers safe, sound, and oblivious to the quiet competence that surrounded them like an invisible shield, protecting them from dangers they would never know existed, guided by skills they could never fully comprehend, brought safely to Earth by the accumulated wisdom of those who had claimed the sky as their domain and would defend it with their lives if necessary. In the end, that was what mattered, not the recognition or the headlines or the congressional hearings, but the simple fact that people who had placed their trust in the ancient human dream of flight had been delivered safely to their destination, one more time, by those who understood that with great privilege comes even greater responsibility. The story of Flight 447 would be retold in training academies and conference rooms, analyzed by investigators and celebrated by survivors. But for Evelyn Ghost Nakamura, it was simply another day when preparation met opportunity, when experience justified itself through application, when the sky once again welcomed home those brave enough to challenge it and skilled enough to prevail.